The cup of water is not going on said table. Just saying. There we go. Morning, all. There we go. The not-so-secret garden. Who knows what secret garden was? Anybody? Yeah? Huh? My question is, does this generation, or will the new generations know this book? You know, it's one of those things that, I think most of us in here grew up with some form of, I'd say, classical education, where we got the classics, right? I mean, so at some level we were promoted the classical Dickens books and the book, Little Women, Steinbeck. We were promoted these stories, and these stories, even though they were kids' stories, had actually very important lessons to learn in life. They weren't trivial. And Secret Garden is no different in that book. This is not a trivial book. Actually, it's kind of the story of a girl who had it all, lost it all, and over time gained, because actually the term Mary, Mary, quite contrary comes from this. Yeah, comes from this, because she was very contrary in her spirit. And over time, that softened. So what a lesson that we learn from a children's book, that this generation really, as it's coming forward, they typically don't have those kind of stories that teach them these life lessons. That we valued things differently over the last 100 years than we value today. So that was just interesting. But the not-so-secret garden, because basically we are talking about the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, we're to the point now in John where Jesus has had the upper room. They've done he's kind of done the Lord's Supper thing. He's talked to the disciples, shared with them, prayed for them, and now they're off to, they don't know what's about to happen, but Jesus certainly does. So the narrative itself, aside from John, is found in Mark 14, Matthew 26, and Luke 22, about this whole Garden of Gethsemane and the rest of Jesus. And as I said here, let me explain. No, that is too much. Let me sum up, okay? So we're going to sum up. Sorry, me and my movie quotes. It's okay. We're going to sum up what Matthew, Mark, and Luke said about this event and compare it a little bit with what John did. So who knows what that is? Actually, no. It's an oil press. Different. They're different. The word Gethsemane actually just means oil press or olive oil press. So when they say, they weren't real original in their names for things during Jesus' time. When they say the Garden of Gethsemane, they literally mean the garden in which there was a Gethsemane, which was the oil press. So where was this situated, though? The Garden of Gethsemane was situated where? Actually, not in Jerusalem. Outside, close to what? What kind of landmark? Mount of Olives. So would it make sense that an olive press would be at the base of the Mount of Olives? Right? Because the Mount of Olives has what? Olive trees. Okay, here we go. Again, they weren't real original in what they did, but it all makes sense here. So the highlights of those things. So they went to the olive grove named Gethsemane. Okay, from Jerusalem, because they were in Jerusalem. So after that whole discourse in the upper room, when he had the Passover meal with his disciples, they come down out of Jerusalem, outside. They walk over and walk up to the Garden of Gethsemane. We're going to talk about a little bit where that was. He told the disciples to sit and pray with him. And then he took Peter, James, and John a little further away themselves and prayed by himself, leaving aside from them. His soul was crushed with grief. He prayed, God, hey, take this burden from me of what's about to happen. The grief was coming. He was about to suffer some of the most excruciating things a human being felt, plus the spiritual side of it in which he was taking all of our sins. This was true grief that's going on in his life. Yet he yielded to God's will. He went back to his disciples 3 times in the garden, chastised them for falling asleep on him. Okay? Judas arrived with an armed crowd, greets Jesus with a kiss. One disciple cuts off a slave's ear. Jesus asks, why now and not at the temple? We're going to see a little bit about that. The disciples flee, and then a naked man goes running off. Okay? That's actually the end of Mark. The last part of Mark is a naked man flees. Nobody really knows the identity of who this naked man was, but the fact that Mark wrote it in and none of the other writers did it, it's kind of assumed that it was John Mark as a younger person. John Mark had a very large role in ministry, yet was not talked about a lot and in glowing ways, right? Paul did not like John Mark. Paul moved him on and then called him back to do some certain things. He didn't have this glowing view throughout the Bible scriptures, yet his ministry ends us with the Gospel of Mark and basically Peter's story of Jesus. Kind of incredible, actually. So it's a good bet that he was the naked man that fled at the end of Mark. Just throwing that out there. That's the tangent for today. Okay. Matthew and Luke do a couple different things. Matthew adds the narrative about using and dying by the sword. He kind of lived by the sword, die by the sword, okay? As well as God's will, if it was God's will, angels could actually save him from this. You don't need to save me from this. If it was God's will, a whole contingent of angels would come down and save me. Luke does not even mention the garden at all. Luke just says they go up to the Mount of Olives. So kind of we've got the point where they're talking about the Mount of Olives, Gethsemane, all kind of in the same breath because they're kind of in the same area. Luke adds that an angel actually comforted Jesus while he was in grief, and that's where Luke also adds that when he sweat, he actually sweat blood. There's a whole other thing that goes wrong with that. We'll just keep moving. And he also adds that Jesus healed the ear of the guy who got his ear cut off. So that was only in Luke, okay? Luke then ends with, hey, power of darkness reigns with the people that are there. That's the sum up of the synoptics, okay? So now we're going to get to John's account of this. I'm going to read through it. We're going to talk about John's intention, and then we're going to hold on to some things that I never saw before, I didn't understand before, and I think are interesting in looking at this narrative and seeing what was going on in this. So we'll just read it straight from the beginning. After saying these things, what particular things was he saying? What are they talking about? Saying what things? You what? He prayed, the high priestly prayer. After saying the John 17 passage, he prayed for his disciples. He said, they are mine and you've kept them in my word and all of those things. That prayer, after saying these things, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples and entered a grove of olive trees. Judas, the betrayer, knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. Now, with blazing torches, lanterns, and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove. Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him, so he stepped forward to meet them. Who are you looking for, he asked. Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. As Jesus said, I am he, they all drew back and fell on the ground. Once more he asked them, who are you looking for? And again they replied, Jesus the Nazarene. I told you that I am he, Jesus said, and since I am the one you want, let these others go. He did this to fulfill his own statement, I did not lose a single one of those you have given me. Then Simon Peter drew his sword, slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. But Jesus said to Peter, put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup of suffering the Father has given me? So the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards arrested Jesus, tied him up. First they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. Caiaphas was the one who had told the Jewish leaders, it is better that one man should die for the people. That is John's account of what happened in the garden. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about here John's unique perspective on this and why this is what he shares with us versus what the other gospel writers did. Because the other gospel writers, beginning with Mark had his testimony of the garden. Matthew's testimony was very similar to it with a couple additions, and Luke's testimony was very similar to it, again with a couple additions. So they had this narrative of what happened in the garden through to the arrest. John had something the gospel writers didn't have, which is 40 plus years of experience before this happened. So he's now looking back from much greater perspective of time. Things have gone on. By the time John's writing, the temple's gone. Jerusalem pretty much is just I don't want to say a barren wasteland, but Jerusalem's pretty much been destroyed by the Romans. Everything that was typically set to be Jewish and how you practiced Judaism was gone, right? This whole system of sacrifices, the sacrificial system, ended in 70 AD. By this point also, those first three letters were known by people. These stories have begun to be shared, and they begin to be shared similarly, so everybody has a piece of this same story. So he certainly has the perspective of, hey, what else needs to be said that wasn't shared already? At this point, heresy or heretics, people trying to change what Jesus had taught, had begun to really become the norm. People began to take the writings of the gospel writers and maybe some other writings of people that weren't necessarily there, or made up their own little stories so they could tell particular stories about Jesus. Okay? So heretics have been introduced, and John certainly is writing to combat many of those heresies that have been filling in about what they're doing. And here's one I just figured out this morning. By the time John wrote, almost all, if not all, of the main characters other than himself were gone. The funny part about that was kind of in my head was, if you noticed in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, a disciple cut off Jesus' ear. Didn't mention his name. John, being the honey badger, not caring, okay, does what? Calls him out by name, Peter. That's an interesting aspect here too. By this point, everybody's gone. He doesn't have to withhold pieces of information possibly that would maybe embarrass somebody and at the same time harm their ministry a little bit. If they're alive and you're talking about them in a negative way, so to speak, that can harm a little bit of their testimony, a little bit of their ministry. By this point, all of these characters are gone, and now John can just lay this out kind of as it is without having any kind of consideration of that. So that's his unique perspective. So we're going to go through this, and we're going to find different nuggets of what happened in here that we may not have ever known. So, after saying these things, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley. What was the Kidron Valley? Now, obviously, anything happening around Jerusalem over time had many, many, many different things of importance. This is Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, so this is north, this is south, west, east. This square, big rectangular area was the Temple Mount. The Kidron Valley is this valley that runs to the east of the Temple Mount, and it's hard to see on the map, but I'll have it here. The Mount of Olives is here, and Gethsemane is at the base of the Mount of Olives, okay? One of the things that's interesting, we're going to see some perspective here, is the elevation changes of this area. One of them is, if you're looking from Gethsemane, this is kind of a view from what we think is Gethsemane, basically, and you're looking up. This is now the Temple Mount now. That's the Dome of the Rock that's built where the temple possibly was. The temple itself would have been a huge structure, large, many stories tall, so it would have given you this massive perspective looking up at the Temple Mount from this area. You would have been able to see what's going on in the temple. This is the valley that runs between Gethsemane and the Temple Mount, and in that valley was a brook. And it's very much, if I said a wash around here, what does it look like? What is it? Bunch of rocks, very dry, right? Is there water running there consistently? No, not at all. When does water run in our little creeks and brooks? And when monsoons hit, maybe if we get around a mountain time, the time that there's snow melt coming off the mountain, correct? That's very similar to what's happening in this brook right here. Typically, this brook is dry most of the year. During the rainy season, it would drain, and it would drain off out of Jerusalem because of the height of Jerusalem into the brook, and the brook itself basically flowed. And if you can kind of get some perspective here, this is the Dead Sea. What's the elevation of the Dead Sea? It's like over 1,000 feet below sea level, okay? Jerusalem is 2,500 feet or more above sea level. So you're dropping 3,500 feet in about 30 miles. So all of that drainage would drain down from Jerusalem through this brook, creek type thing and into the river. Now, with that, what was going on in the temple at the time of the Passover and Jesus crossing the Kidron Valley? What was happening inside the temple? What was it? Sacrifices. How many sacrifices? Try hundreds of thousands. Possibly as many as 250,000 lambs. Put that in perspective. How many lambs could you fit in this building? Maybe 250 in here. And what would it smell like? Wonderful. Okay. The smell would be, and that's not even slaughtering the lambs. Okay? Just put in your mind 250,000 lambs being taken into a single area, and the amount of logistics it would take to slaughter 250,000 lambs. And by the way, when they slaughtered them, what did they have to do to make them kosher? Do what? Drain all of the blood out of them. How much blood is that? Along with the ritual washing water that would go with it. Where did all of that go? If we go back, all of that fed into this Kidron Brook. So what color was the Kidron Brook at this time? Red with blood. And it says Jesus did what in order to get there? Jesus actually would have come out of the lower city, crossed the Kidron Valley here to get to Gethsemane. And this, in perspective, this is about 3 miles. This is not a huge, it's not like they're walking 15, 20 miles to do this. This would be 2 or 3 miles to get to this thing. But what would he pretty much do constantly as he was getting there? He'd be crossing this brook. And what is in the brook? What? Do you think that he had some kind of idea of what was going on and some symbolism that was happening? Also, like I said, ancient things that happens with Israel. This valley was known for many things. One was the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Several of the kings, when they came in and got rid of all of the idols out of the temple, took the idols out to the Valley of Kidron and demolished them there. So every time Israel kind of got cleansed, it got cleansed by this valley and the destruction of all of the idols and different things that are in this valley. Okay? The one kind of cool one is this. Inside this valley is known as the tomb of Absalom. Who was Absalom? David's son. What did David's son do? He rebelled. In the story of Absalom and him, David's trusted person, was it a Philippat, something of that nature, some of fat, we'll just say that, okay, was a trusted person, trusted advisor, betrayed David to Absalom, and David fled through the valley of Kidron. Okay? So there may have been some thought of Jesus even in terms of his betrayal, because Philippat actually, he actually hung himself for the betrayal. Is that familiar to anybody? Right? What did Judas do? So this, and there are other things with olives and olive presses and things of that nature, but I just wanted to give you an idea that the Valley of Kidron actually had some significant meaning And here's the other thing. See if I ended up doing okay. After saying these things, Judas the betrayer knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. Okay, where do we get that from? Well, in Luke, before we get to this passage, it says this: every day Jesus went to the temple to teach, and each evening he returned to spend the night on the Mount of Olives. So after Jesus had the triumphal entry a little over a week before the Passover time, every day what was Jesus doing? He went into the temple, he taught, and actually the verse after this says, people were waiting for him in the mornings to come back out and go back to his teaching. Okay? So it was known that he was sitting in the temple every day teaching. And a lot of the passages that lead up to the Garden of Gethsemane, all the teaching, some of the confrontations that he had with the Pharisees, all happened while he was in the temple during this time. And a lot of that was the reason it began to get so vitriolic between him, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees was what he was teaching while he was there. Okay? So they were getting more and more agitated by Jesus and he was doing this. But each day, when he would finish, he would leave the temple, leave the people, go out and get up to the Mount of Olives or the Garden of Gethsemane. So likely they had a place to stay in Gethsemane. Okay? That was their home base, so to speak. It was a place they could kind of get away from the crowds, get away from the people. Jesus certainly would go up to the Mount of Olives and pray, get refreshed with God before he would go back into the temple and continue his teaching. Okay? So Judas was very familiar with this place. This is important. Jesus made it a point to be familiar with this place. John kind of points that out for us. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers. Interestingly enough, that's the New Living Translation version. The NASB says a different word. Judas, having received the Roman cohort. Okay, cohort. Cohort was a percentage or a place of the Roman legion that was stationed there. In earlier times, a cohort was about 80 soldiers that was head by a leader. By the time Jesus' time, a cohort could be as many as 480 to 600 soldiers. Okay? Why is that important? Well, in the depictions of this time in Jesus' arrest, they had the torches and the pitchforks and they went out to see him. We think maybe 20 people went out there to go get Jesus, so to speak. But in reality, this could have been as little as 250 and as many as 1,000 people going out to the Garden of Gethsemane to get this guy Jesus and his followers. At night, where they don't have streetlights. Right? Is this unusual for Jews at the time to be out at night? This is not a common thing for them. Not only that, we get in later, we get to see Annas and Caiaphas. They're ready for a trial of Jesus before the break of dawn. So we're talking, because when did Peter betray Jesus one of the times? It said, what happened right after he betrayed him? The rooster crowed. What times do rooster crows? They usually crow sometime 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. So put that in your head about where their mindset was in going to get Jesus. They were scared of something. They brought a lot of people to go get him. Okay? And was their intent just to arrest Jesus? No. They wanted all of his followers. Here's an interesting question, since I'm on interesting questions. Was it just the 12 that were in the garden? Well, we know there was at least one other person, do we not? The naked man who fled. Right? He was naked. He fled. So we at least know one other person was there. It is a good bet that there were many more people that were with Jesus going out to here than just the 12 disciples that we kind of assume that was with him. When they went out 2 by 2, how many actually went out? 70, right? There's 7. So disciples did not just mean 12 people. Those 12 disciples were important because they became the apostles. They became the leaders, the head, the people that they would listen to as they went out, because they didn't have a lot of written record of all of this. They needed people with eyewitness accounts of Jesus to basically break down and make sure people were being taught properly. Because again, what had began happening? False teachers began to claim the name of Jesus and say, oh, by the way, in Jesus' name, I'm going to do this sorcery. I'm going to do it for my own benefit. I'm going to do it for my own glorification. But we're going to put the name of Jesus on it. So the disciples were important in making sure that they were counted as the people who were the head leaders of the group, but they weren't necessarily just the only ones that were there. There were others. So when they brought 650 people, they were intending to arrest probably 20 to 70 people, and or worried about whether they were going to revolt, fight, and do stuff. And they had good cause, because what did Peter end up doing? Okay? I put a picture of this. That's about 80. So just to give you an idea, so 80 to 400 soldiers, plus chief priests, people from the temple, and the temple police. Again, all up at midnight, 1 in the morning, because that's when this was going down. These guys weren't normal. Yeah, I'm sure they were tired, because his disciples certainly were tired, according to the synoptics, were they not? What'd they have a hard time doing? Staying awake. Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him, so he stepped forward to meet them. Our English language does some funny things to us. One of the interesting things that we get, and I'm going to say this from the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I'm going to talk about it a little later too, but Jesus was presented as the suffering servant, almost presented like a victim. He wasn't, but one, if you don't have the understanding of who Jesus is, if you're not a Jesus follower, you could read the accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke and go, oh, poor Jesus, they really went after him. They really did something to him that shouldn't have happened. That was injustice to happen to him, okay? Our English language here almost insinuates that at this moment, Jesus realized what they were going to do to him. But a better translation of that I got from the ISV, thanks Josh for your ISV, love the ISV, then Jesus, knowing everything that was going to happen to him, puts a little better spin on this, right? Did Jesus have any doubt of what was about to happen? No. There was no victimhood. He knew exactly what was about to happen. And everything that he had done up to this point was leading here. He's intentionally going to the same place every night with the same people doing the same thing. Jesus the Nazarene, they replied, and he said, I am he. What other places do we see I am? What's the original I am? Burning bush. Who is it? I am. Tell them that I am has seen you. That's God's name. Where is I am now important in terms of John? Name him. I am the bread of life. What else? I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. I am the light of the world. This is the same phrase. I also want to notice that he's the one that initiated the conversation for a very particular purpose. He said, who are you looking for? They had to say, Jesus the Nazarene, and then he says, I am he. But what happens when he says, I am he? Boom. They all drew back and fell to the ground. Okay, do you think they had to change a few pants? That's not normal, guys. When someone speaks, it's not normal that people draw and fall back onto the ground, okay? That's 400 to 600, 650 people being affected because a dude went, "I am he." That's not normal, and they're kind of frightened now, okay? I just say that because who just took control of the situation? Jesus did. And there's a very specific purpose for that. Who are you looking for? And again, they replied, because he did it a second time, Jesus the Nazarene. And he said, "I told you I am he, and since I am the one you want, let these others go." Jesus took control. Jesus made them state who they're looking for. They didn't say Jesus and his followers. They said Jesus the Nazarene. Therefore, he called out their hand and said, "You're only here for me. These others can go away." And that was important in all of this, because had they all been arrested, who knows where their mind, could they have been killed in the arrest? All kinds of things could have happened during this time. Jesus, that was not the plan. That was not the time. Their time was to go, and Jesus made sure that happened. He did this to fulfill his own statement. "I did not lose a single one of those you have given me." So there was purpose and power in what Jesus was doing and saying. And of course, then Simon Peter, John likes to call Simon Peter out. I don't know if they had a problem together, but he certainly was. I mean, Peter started taking it on the chin at this point, right? I mean, we know a lot. There was great things about Peter and what Peter did, but we also know some of the not so great things that Peter did, and he's called out by name on that front. So Simon Peter drew a sword and slashed the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. "Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the suffering the Father has given me?" Again, calms the situation down. Makes sure that he's the one they take. Protects his so they can go on. At that point, the soldiers, the commanding officer, and the temple guards arrested Jesus. Again, all these people handcuff this one dude and start walking out. Kind of silly, actually, at this point, it seems, but it wasn't so silly to them at the time. What's one of the things that Jesus actually said to them at this point in the other Gospels? What did he ask them? "Why didn't you take me while I was sitting in the temple? You knew exactly where I was going to be. Every day I was in the temple. I'm teaching. Why didn't you come?" And by the way, it's rhetorical. He's calling them out. He's saying, "You guys are so afraid of me that you wouldn't do this publicly when I'm standing right there. You just walk in, take me, and you're afraid." They had to do this under the cover of night at 1 a.m. to come get this guy and his people and bring a whole contingent of people to it. And soon after, all the trials and things, I mean, guys, Jesus had 6 trials, so to speak, all happening basically in one day. That's a lot of coordination, particularly during the time of Jesus' time. They didn't have cars. They didn't have radio communication to say, "Hey, Jesus is coming, be ready," right? They had to have a lot of coordination to pull this kind of thing off, to get Jesus from Annas to Caiaphas to Pilate, back to Herod, back to Pilate, and then off into doing the things that they did. A lot of things had to go down. But Caiaphas said and called it out and said, "It is better that one man should die for the people." And Jesus made sure that was so. Did he not? Okay. John brought clarity to this situation. The gospel writers presented Jesus as the suffering servant. He was grieved. He sweat tears of blood. He had to be comforted by an angel. He was asking for the support of his disciples, okay? They're not showing Jesus as weak. They're just presenting him differently. He is the suffering servant. He is the human. This is the human part of him dealing with what's about to come, okay? Unfortunately, as human beings, people will take that and run with it and become Jehovah's Witnesses. Because Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus was just a man. Just a man, maybe an angel, maybe the archangel Michael. God just used him to do this sacrifice, and that was it. Jehovah's Witnesses hate the book of John. They hate the book of John. Why? Jesus brought clarity, or John brought clarity to who Jesus was. He said, because I only pick on Jehovah's Witnesses at this point because that's just something we know today. This idea that Jesus was just simply a man goes all the way back to when, right after Jesus died, people started doing things like this. And John had to address it so that he didn't talk about the sweating of blood. He didn't talk about the grief. He didn't talk about the soul crushing. He simply talked about Jesus took control of the situation and made sure that his people didn't go where they needed to go and that he went where he was going to go. Does that make sense? John establishes that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and everything in between. That's your Savior. That's how important John was to who. If we don't have John, we probably don't have the idea of the Trinity. Okay? It's just that big of a deal. It's that portion that we say Jesus is God. It is presented as him as God in the other areas, but John makes it crystal clear. He leaves no doubt of who Jesus is. That's our first lesson. Our second lesson, and the worship team can come up on this one. And since I am the one you want, let these others go. Before they get to the Gethsemane, no, Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And we put it all on Peter, but look at the next phrase in Mark 14:31. And all the others vowed the same. I ain't going to betray. I'd never do that. Oh, Jesus, I'm with you. Can you imagine? I mean, this is not a group of 12. This is a group of possibly 30 to 70 people all agreeing. We're in this with you, Jesus, till the very end. We're there. 19 verses later in Mark. Then all his disciples deserted him and ran away. 19 verses later. Possibly 2 hours in real time. That fast. Okay. I ask you, how often do we desert him? Okay? And it's not unique to me or you or my brother Steve back there. Hi, Steve. We've seen the work of Jesus in our life. We've seen the work of Jesus in other lives. We may have been experiencing it for 40 years, and yet something happens. Someone is sick, someone passes away, you're sick, you're on the brink of death. Your financial situation is in ruins. Your family situation is in jeopardy. And what do? All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's paths to follow our own. This is not a unique scenario to the disciples leaving Jesus in his time of need. In fact, it was God's plan that they did, guys. And I'm going to look at you and go, your times of trouble, your times of pain, your times where this life has burdens upon you, has a plan. It has a place. it does something to us because we require humility in order to worship our living God. I did not lose a single one of those you have given me. He hadn't lost you. You're not gone. He's there for you. I actually just watched episode 2 of The Chosen last night in season 4. Matthew's talking with Gaius, who's the Roman officer, and he's explaining to Gaius. He says, every morning I wake up, I'm confused, I have regret, I don't know where my place in this world is. But he says, then I see him. And it all gets simple real fast. And Gaius looks at him and goes, what? I follow him. And everything else takes care of itself. Father, these narrative stories, they have meaning, they have impact. They bring joy. I love this story. I love the stories of the disciples, of Jesus, of what really happened here, and really contemplating and understanding this was a real event with real people and real emotions. And even after all of the miracles they saw, the change that happened in their life, Matthew went from a tax collector to a Jesus follower. Simon went from a zealot looking to kill Romans to a Jesus follower. Yet after all of that, and after proclaiming boldly, we will never die, we will die for you, we'll never betray you. 2 hours later, they go running. And that happens in our life. We see our life change. We see you work over and over again in our life, and yet there's moments where we desert you. But you haven't lost us. And you won't lose us as you didn't lose them. We're going to come. We're going to share in the bread and in the blood. And just taking it as a symbol of our knowing we all turn to our own way. But he laid on you all of it. Bless us in our time of just remembering your sacrifice for us in communion. Bless us in our time of communion together after we're done. And thank you for not losing any of your own.